So here are all the components you will receive. There is the wiring with the fuse holder, 2 fuses, a self-drilling screw, an extra crimp connector, a few zip ties, the cover, the relay and harness, and the relay itself. This is the configuration you will receive it, with the 25 amp fuse installed, cover on, relay in, and self-drilling screw already in its place. So on this vehicle, it has a little bit of a modified engine bay, so we're going to go over to another vehicle and take a look at the first steps. But first we want to take a look at the tools you'll need. Should be pretty easy. A 10mm, a T25, and a 7mm are all you'll need for taking out bolts. And then you're going to need a good quality crimp tool. I'm going to be using my 1/4 inch impact and that tool because it's easier to do one-handed while operating a camera. You will also want something to heat shrink the butt connector. So I have a butane torch. You could use a lighter. If you had just done the fuel pump, I recommend you don't use a lighter and you use a hot air gun, or you let it evaporate completely. You're also going to want either a cloth tape like this, either the fuzzy or the plastic kind, and or electrical tape. And that'll give you a little bit of a more seamless install in the engine bay. So here's the other engine bay. We're going to want to take out the battery and the airbox. For the battery, there's sometimes a holder here, and it just kind of gets pushed off into the side. 2 10mm terminals come off, and the battery will get removed. For the airbox, there is a hose clamp here with a 7mm head, so loosen that, and then it might take a little bit of force to pop it off. Undo the MAF connector, and then the entire airbox swings up and out. If you actually still have one of these, you can remove it. The airbox comes out pretty easily. It does have a wire that's clipped in on the back here, and that's the ignition coil wire. So now, with the battery out and the airbox out, you'll have plenty of room. So we're going to go back to the vehicle that we're actually installing it on and show you where to go from there. The part that we're installing is the wiring. So to get this ready, airbox out, battery out, and then we're going to remove this 10mm here on the top of the battery post, and this is where we'll be applying the ring terminal. If you want to stealth install, you could also open up the cover here and put the wire down in, and that's where we'll start. So once this wire is installed on the ring terminal and tucked in here, we're going to mount the fuse holder. The fuse holder is going to go on this plastic, underneath this plastic nut, angled like so, right underneath the identification plate in the engine bay. It takes very little torque to tighten this plastic nut, so don't be too aggressive with it. You could almost do it all with your fingers. Once this is installed, you can put some of the either electrical or plastic tape around this just to kind of keep it all together. I'm just going to go and move ahead with the installation. The next step is to feed the wire through the firewall. There are 2 options for this. The first one, which I recommend, is to use a plastic tube that is already in the firewall. The easiest way to find this tube is to follow this bright white plastic line. For this specific vehicle, you can see it enter there. This one doesn't have the corrugated tubing on it, nor the plastic end. But when those exist, you're going to need to snip the end of the rubber cap and insert it through there. Take this and feed it in a couple feet at a time, and you'll see it come down underneath the kick panel, and you could start pulling it through. Your other option is to undo this cover for the fuse box and feed it in through there, and I'll show you that right now. To remove the cover, there are 4 T25s. So we'll quickly take those off. This guy needs a little more. So you can feed the wire through this plastic cover, and then if you can, you could snake it down through this gap. If that gap ends up being a bit too small, you can also drill about a 10mm 7/16 hole at about a 20-degree angle facing towards the shifter, and that'll give you plenty of room. This is an alternate install if you wanted it completely enclosed in the clamshell, or you already had several wires for, in this case we have gauges and other things that are already running through that tube. Even with a full AEM gauge, which is, I think it's a total of 10 wires coming through there in 2 separate bundles, I'm still able to easily fit the end of this connector through there. So that's what I'm going to do now, and if you need to use this option, there should be enough wire included in the kit to do so. So once we have pushed through several feet of wire, I'm going to come in and take a look. You may need to take off the kick panel here, and those are going to be T25s as well. At this point, you're going to want to pull through a good bit of the wiring. Make sure that you don't pull in too much of the wire and start pulling this out. So either, a friend or, a reasonable guess. For me right now, I'm just going to grab and I'm going to pull as I'm watching to know when I'm done with pulling all the wire through. So in this case, it looks like, yeah, there's a little bit of a tangle, so we just straighten it out a little bit, no big deal. Continue pulling until we have a little bit of slack left. So I probably should have thought about how I'm going to route this. Usually I route it underneath everything. This bolt won't usually be here. Underneath and through. So now we're going to move to the inside of the vehicle. And you won't need any tools just yet. So we're going to remove this panel here. This part comes forward or towards you, and then it clips up. Right here, you're going to want to move it out, and if it doesn't want to, you can pivot the top part up and that part of the trim down. This part here pops up, and you're able to remove the whole piece. Set it aside for right now, doesn't need to go too far. We're going to pull back part of the carpet. So if you have a clutch pedal, tuck it underneath there, or the brake pedal, and just start moving it out. You shouldn't need to remove this panel, so don't bother with that. We're then going to move to the rear of the vehicle. And this is a wagon with rear seats, so this is going to be one of the harder vehicles to do it on. So it'll be easier on sedans and on wagons. So we're going to first remove the seat just to make it easier. You could probably do it without removing the seat. In fact, I have done it without removing the seat. But it doesn't take much effort to remove the seat. Alright, so the seat gets pulled out and the back gets dropped down, but not before we remove this panel here. This panel here, you're going to need your T25 right here. And again, same as we did for the front. Pull it up, set it aside. So here's the screw you're going to need to remove. You can pull the top of this down and out, get a little bit more room, and then quickly remove it. And then, as we did with the front, remove this trim panel. Move the carpet back, and we'll be ready to run the wire towards the back. At this point, lower the back, and there's the connector here that you just set down, and we'll move to the back where we're going to take out the back seat and gain access to the fuel pump area. Alright, so we're in the back of the vehicle, and this one has third row, as we said before. But if you don't, then you're just going to lift up the whole back. But for the third row, you're just going to lift up the backs of the seats. And then you're going to remove the side panels here. Just lift gently, move over. And this will give us access to these four 10 millimeters. Set those somewhere safe. Take these plates out, set them aside. And then this whole back seat is able to just be lifted and moved back and out of our way. Once you have the back seat out, you could take this carpet and fold it back, or you could completely remove it. In our case, it'll be just good enough to fold it back. And from here, we'll be able to access the fuel pump and everything else. If you need to install a fuel pump, at this point you can go to the other video where that is shown. But for us, we're going to just install the wiring. So at this point, we want to get the main wire back here first before we install the rest of the components. So let's do that first. We'll route it underneath the carpet, up through where the back seat is, and then over and down to about this area next to the fuel pump. So now that the power wire is here, we're going to unplug the fuel pump. This is the fuel pump plug. It's the gray one. And then we're going to mount our relay assembly. You want it to be mounted right about here. There isn't too much room to move it in either direction, or have it up here. It sticks out a little too far and will leave an indentation in your rear seat if you have it. If you have no rear seat, then you can most likely set it up here somewhere. But I just really prefer it here. It works even if you have spare tire and a ton of other stuff underneath here. It's out of the way, it's easy to access, and you don't need to remove the back seat again to access the relay for testing, replacement, modification purposes again. So we're going to mount it here using the self-drilling screw that is provided. And then we will hook up the connections. They only go one way. The ground, there will be an extra ground, and this is to help with decreasing the load through the already very thin wires that are part of the fuel pump circuit. We're going to use the closest to us bolt here. So remove the nut, and then you will put the ring terminal onto there and snug it back up. So it's going to require two hands, so I'm going to mount this relay. Now that the relay holder is installed, all the connectors are plugged in, you will need to insert and crimp this connection. Hold it together while using the crimp, or if you're able to set it in there, just crimp it. Make sure that you use adequate force. You want a strong indentation on it, and you need to use a proper crimping tool, not pliers or a hammer or anything of that sort. Those do not provide the point source of pressure to deform the metal and properly crimp this. The reason why we're using a crimp is there really isn't a way to fit a single pole connector that is capable of handling reasonable amperage through the firewall. So this is the best solution that we have currently. If we come up with a better solution, this video will be updated. Once you have crimped the connection, give it a good tug. A proper crimp connection should be very strong and not be a weak point. It should not pull out easily. So make sure that it's on there well. Once that's done, use either a heat shrink gun or a lighter or something of that sort to heat up this heat shrink, and it'll fully seal this in and also provide a little bit more mechanical rigidity to prevent any type of fatigue that you might subject it to over rough roads or just regular driving. Alright, now that this is sealed, you can install the relay and add a zip tie if you want to keep everything kind of nice. And the reassembly is just the reverse of the disassembly. So goes back in. Remember your plates, your 4 bolts. Lay it back down and run the wire underneath the carpet and put the trim panels back in.